Okay, we're back. We're live. We're here on Hawaii, the state of health, on a given Tuesday. I'm Jay Fidell, and with me to my left, Keith Kawaoka, who is a doctor of environment, and the deputy director of the Department of Health in Environmental Health Administration. And to his left, Stuart Yamada, who is an engineer and chief of the Environmental Management Division of the State Department of Health. Welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Thank you, Jay. Thanks for having us.
Great to have you here. So we're going to entitle this, Our Environment is Part of Our Health. Whether people know it or not, the State Department of Health in the state of Hawaii is inextricably intertwined with environment. On the theory, I suppose, that a good environment is necessary to good health. Is that the connection?
I think that's a good perspective. Yeah.
And you have a special fund that you established by law, where you get money from the legislature in order to spend it on special staffing and special projects for the environment. Can you talk about that, Stuart, Keith?
Sure. The Environmental Response Revolving Fund started in the late 80s. And the funding came in the early 90s through what most people know as the barrel tax. We were the first fund established under the barrel tax. We get, to this day, 5 cents for every barrel of imported oil into the state. And through the years, primarily the intent was for oil response and chemical response for emergency releases into the state. Later through the years, the fund was expanded by the legislature to include other areas, for example, like groundwater and safe drinking water protection, cleanup of contaminated lands, looking also at other areas in terms of other areas of environmental protection. So the fund did get expanded through the years to the point where now, later in the years, in actually 2010, legislature increased the barrel tax another $1 to $1.05. And that was primarily for the purpose of in the areas of energy security and food security. The Department of Health still relied on the 5 cents, as I said, to this day. So it's right now $1.05.
You're still getting only 5 cents out?
Correct.
And that's always in contention every year. Everybody,
right,
jockeying around for a piece of it.
Yeah. And then during that session, the legislature took 60 cents of that $1.05
for a special,
went to the general fund.
General fund.
Right.
Yeah. You don't have to say anything, but they shouldn't have done that. They should have left it for the original purposes intended instead of scooping it into the general fund. But I mean, I'm associated with Hawaii Energy Policy Forum, so I can say that. Well, hopefully one day we'll return this back to normalcy. But in the meantime, is 5 cents enough?
Right now, it's not. And we have gone to the legislature to let them know that the 5 cents is not sufficient for several reasons. One is that the revenue from the barrel tax overall is going down every year, approximately about 5% every year. To a point where, and it's for good reason, the state is using less oil.
This is just like the cancer fund, the cigarette tax. There's fewer people smoking cigarettes, so there's less money. So cancer research has less money out of it.
Yeah, I mean, overall, the state is doing a good job of consuming less oil, going toward, in part, to more renewable energy sources. So from the tax revenue part, it's not boding well for the Department of Health programs, which relies on the barrel tax, the 5 cents per barrel. So our revenues have gone down quite a bit to support right now 41 positions.
41 positions are associated with the environmental risks, hazardous materials, and so forth.
Right.
And these 41 positions deal in that area.
Yeah, it's a pretty broad area. Like I said, the fund did get expanded through the years. It doesn't include just emergency response, but includes cleanup of contaminated lands, groundwater protection, safe drinking water protection, a fairly broad area of environmental protection programs right now.
So how much actually comes out for you in American money?
Right now, the tax is generating approximately about $1.1 million per year. with our 5 cents
That's
per
not a
barrel.
lot when you have 41.
No, it's not. Yeah, it's
41.
not adequate, frankly. And we are going to the legislature this session to ask for a reallocation, if we will, from the general fund.
Of the general fund.
Of 10 cents more.
15
per barrel.
altogether.
15
cents,
altogether.
so that'll give you what?
Approximately about
300.
3.5 million.
3.5
Yeah.
million.
And, that may not be adequate as well. So we are looking or working with the legislature now to looking at potentially exploring the possibility of moving some of the positions to general fund to sort of alleviate the burden on the what we call the ERF, the Environmental Response Revolving Fund.
But I'm getting this, though, that right now, these 41 positions are covered by the barrel tax.
That's correct.
There's no general fund money in
Correct.
that.
Right now, and let me clarify that, right now there's 31 filled positions. We have 10 vacancies right now of the 41.
Why? Because you don't have the money to hire them?
Partly that, because we actually did institute a hiring freeze for those 10 positions, not to add more burden onto the fund.
Yeah.
But also the positions, there are various types of positions, but they're quite difficult to fill, and a lot of them, they require a lot of technical expertise in specialized areas. So some have been vacant for a while. Some fairly recent because people have retired or left the state.
Yeah, everybody's retiring lately. I've noticed that in my travels. It could be that I know the wrong people. Okay, so Stuart, the engineer part fascinates me. Okay, and Keith was talking about experts and expertise. Why do I feel that you need to have an engineer in this force so that you can deal with all the technical issues?
Well, so I address all my friends who aren't engineers. Environment is clearly bigger than just engineers. We have a lot of environmental health specialists. You need that kind of scientific background at a minimum. Engineers are biased. We like to think we were trained, and work experience bring us to identify and resolve problems. But you need that cadre of broad experience: biology, chemistry, environmental sciences. I mean, Keith and I are probably some of the few dinosaurs that actually have environmental educational background. The vast majority of our staff don't. It's basically on-the-job training. But it's really important. I mean, our old boss used to always complain that we always would preface everything that's too complicated, you wouldn't understand. But that's
We don't
not,
do that here in
Oh, of
ThinkTech.
course not. Of course not. And he knows it's not true. But the fact remains that it helps. You have to have that analytical background because you have to look at things objectively. No surprise, the general public is really good at diagnosing environmental problems. It was that caused my illness. It was that caused, my hair to fall out or turn all white, in my case. But we know it tends to be weak science. And that's where you need that technical background to help. It's not the answer to everything.
So, yeah, I want to get a sort of a handle on what it might do. Suppose there was no issue about money, as I mentioned before the show. Suppose I gave you 100 million, 200 million. What would you do with it in order to meet this mission? What kinds of initiatives, what kinds of projects, what kinds of expertise would you want to have to do what jobs?
Well, if money was no object, I would, and this is my personal opinion, but I would think you would spend that money in several different areas. One would be in the areas of emergency preparedness, whether it's a natural disaster or a man-made disaster. Then impending disaster is just a day or so from here of occurring. So whatever we can do to prepare beforehand for those kind of disasters, rather than waiting to the last minute, I think that's money well spent. I think the state's going a long way toward developing that kind of structure in cooperation with the federal government. But my premise is you can never be fully prepared. You always have to, train and exercise and, get educate the people that would be affected by that disaster.
It's heightened, isn't it, when you're when you're 2,500 miles away from the next state, when you have to be self-reliant, where you have to have the resources available to act immediately.
That's right. I mean, we've always been told that don't expect any help for at least 48 hours to 72 hours or even longer. So during that time when the cavalry comes from the mainland to help us out, we're on our own. Yeah, we're on our own. So whatever assets and resources we have, is what we have before that disaster happens.
So what assets, what resources would we want to have? I mean, boats, for example, vehicles, aircraft, drones for spotting. Would we want to have, specialized equipment for example, oil spills? What do you like? What's on your shopping list?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good area to bring up, because that's my area of where I come from, is from the oil spills, chemical spills side of the house, where if there is a potential spill offshore in any of the islands, I think we're very well prepared to meet any kind of challenge.
Right now, today?
Right now, today.
How much of that is state apparatus and how much of that is the Coast Guard?
Some of both, and also private industry. I
yeah?
think we've actually banded together. Actually, there's a Clean Islands Council that actually helps administer all those assets together. And we work under what we call an incident command system, that all the agencies, as well as the what we call responsible party, if it's an oil company, whoever caused a spill, would basically get together and solve the problem mutually with combined resources together. So I think that part is pretty well. Like I said, you can never be fully prepared for any kind of disaster like an oil spill, but I think from a manpower standpoint, from a capability standpoint, as far as equipment standpoint, I think we're very well prepared anywhere in the country.
Really?
Yes.
Well, that's fantastic.
Yes.
That's great. Are there national meetings where you can make the comparison? We can see how things are going elsewhere?
We do. In terms of the oil spills, we belong to the British Columbia and Western States Consortium, where actually all the states in British Columbia actually get together and sort of share war stories, if you will, of their experiences. We also have, if there's any state that needs help or mutual aid, other states will come and provide that aid. Sort of like what you saw in the Gulf spill, for example. All states and all the federal agencies came and provided that assistance to the Gulf states when that oil spill happened.
That reminds me of some other researchers we had down here from the university last week who were working on research involving that certain bacteria that went past critical mass back in 2006 or 7. And this fellow from the Aloi had a kind of a man-eating or bacteria, flesh-eating kind of experience, which got him. And that was because there was 40 days of rain at the time. And the rain, and the temperature in the water and the rain in the air, I guess, all these factors combined. And before you know it, there was an overabundance of this particular kind of bacteria in the water, which was always there, but it went past critical mass, and that's the problem. And so it strikes me that there's a relationship, it's so delicate balance, between environment and health. For example, if I give you an environment that's 2 degrees warmer, we're going to have all kinds of pathogens that we don't have now. And that is part of your watch, isn't it? You watch the environment, and then you go down the hallway to somebody in infectious diseases, and you make, Sarah Park, for example. I mean, what is the relationship? Can you talk about that?
Well, like you said, it's very intertwined. What happens in environmental health or public health or the medical side is definitely related. Any illnesses that occur, say from a foodborne outbreak, for example, certainly Sarah's team gets involved. I mean, they deal with our sanitarians that do typically the restaurant inspected or the vector control type work. So we all get together as a team to solve that immediate problem that comes about. So there's definitely the integration between the various parts of the department, for sure, as well as other, federal food and drug and other types of public health service that gets involved as well.
Well, speaking of integration of the parts, we're going to take a short break so we can integrate it to the next part. Okay, that's Keith Kawaoka. He's a doctor of environmental engineering, and he's the deputy director of the Department of Health and in the Environmental Health Administration. And Stuart Yamada, who's an engineer and the chief of the Environmental Management Division of the State Department of Health. When we come back, I'd like to talk about how the system works so that you can communicate. What communication systems, and first something you said, Stuart, what is the thought process the problem-solving, the paradigm, if you will, on how you solve a given problem with the available resources. We'll be right back after this short break.
Aloha, I'm Hunter Hevlin, host of Sustainable Hawaii here at ThinkTech Hawaii. You can tune in every week on Thursday at 2 p.m. to see interviews with sustainability professionals from around the state and even further abroad, learning about activities with water management, food security, waste management, and a whole host of other fascinating opportunities to get engaged with making a greener island. So if you're interested in making the transition from consuming individuals to communities of producers, check us out every Thursday.
Inspired by an ancient culture, classical Chinese dance, vigorous physicality, timeless stories, 5,000 years of Chinese music and dance, Shen Yun presents authentic Chinese culture. Coming to Blaisdell Concert Hall, May 8th and 9th. Tickets at shenyun.com or call 808-792-3919.
Okay, we're back. We're live with Keith Kawaoka and Stuart Yamada of the State Department of Health. They both deal in environmental matters, environmental administration, and we're talking about our environment as part of our health. And if you didn't know, the Department of Health is deeply involved in the environment on the basis that they're inextricably intertwined here in Hawaii. So, just like to know how it works, and maybe the best way to look at this is to talk about real events that really happened. How do you call on those resources? How do you deploy those resources to get the necessary protections, necessary outcome? I'll talk about one that I remember, which is the molasses spill off Matson and the dock out there, I guess, in the waterfront. How did that work? How did that go? What could you do?
Well, we first got notification of that situation, both from the other state agencies, Department of Transportation, Harbors Division, as well as from the public that saw this murky black substance in the water and could figure out what it was or where it was coming from. So that was the start of the incident, if you will. And we deployed various teams out there from our Clean Water Branch, Hazard Evaluation Emergency Response Office, and other programs within Stuart's shop. So we tried to identify what that substance was. At that time, we did not know where it was coming from or what it was. It was just showing up in many parts of the harbor. And at that point, it wasn't really killing marine life, but we saw some traces of it early on. So that was the beginning of the incident, and we formed basically a team to identify what could be, what it was and what to do about it.
So technically, how could you find out what it was? I mean, you see it there. It's a black substance. You know it's not usually there. You can make a wild conclusion that this is not a good thing. And maybe it is a problem with public health. So how do you go down that thought process?
Well, really, if Keith doesn't mind, it heavily involved Matson. Matson had to look within with themselves and their contractor to try and isolate, because clearly they weren't taking credit for any of this damage that was occurring. But I think collectively everybody was trying to seek out answers. Yes, there were suspicions all along, but there was always a hesitation to say that indeed it was molasses. We never saw molasses in the harbor before.
Yeah, that's the interesting part.
It is.
In the 21st century, we have new chemicals, new substances, new risks. Who knows what it could have been?
Who would have thought it?
Who would have thought? And the funny thing is that it teaches us something, is that in the 21st century, we may find more things out there that we didn't know would happen.
Very wise.
So what happened after that?
Well, literally it's detective work. We rely on different sources of information.
CSI, Department of Health.
In a way, yeah. I mean, other than obviously doing some sampling, water sampling, we rely on the agencies and organizations that are at the harbor to see if they notice anything unusual or operations that might have been going on that might have been causing that situation. So we try to get as much information from the field, if you will, to identify what the problem could be. And actually, it wasn't until a couple of days later, then we actually did identify that it was molasses. It was from the loading operations out in Pier 51 Bravo.
Did you have a laboratory involved somehow?
We did. We had our own state laboratory that Clean Water Branch took samples, ran it up the lab, and then they identified, they didn't know it was molasses per se, but it had the constituents of molasses. So,
But
and then at that point, Matson said, "Oh, by the way, we did surveying under the pier, and we found this leak, fairly small leak, but enough to cause that kind of spill."
But then the question arises, and I'm sure you were thinking of it at the time, is what does this mean? What does it mean to the environment? Because we don't have molasses spills usually.
Right.
They happen at sea, and it doesn't much matter. But here in the harbor with all that, vulnerable, fragile marine life and the reef and all that, you don't know what's going to happen because we haven't had the experience. So what happens?
Right.
How do you deal with that?
Well, it's an incident nonetheless. It's an emergency situation. Once we identify what it was, what you do from an incident response standpoint, you try to identify where it's coming from and try to stop it, prevent it from further going into the environment. So that was our immediate
And that
step.
happened. You were
Yeah,
able to
we did that. We
find
did.
the source and
Yeah.
close it down.
Yeah. And then determine to what extent that release is going throughout the harbor and what kind of damage it might be causing. So that's where we deployed additional sampling teams throughout the harbor. That was the point where a few days later the marine life started to show up, floating on the surface. We also deployed teams from Department of Land and Natural Resources, University of Hawaii, as well as Fish and Wildlife Service to do beneath the surface type of surveys, the coral damage, for example. And then we also deployed aerial surveys, helicopter flights, to see the extent of damage and all that. By then, we had called in the Coast Guard and Environmental Protection Agency and other NOAA, as well as Fish and Wildlife Service, to participate in the incident response team.
Incident response team, I'm sorry, I'm ignorant about who runs an incident response team. Is it the Department of Health?
The incident response team is part of what we call the Incident Command System, ICS, and it's a nationally recognized structure to deal with these kinds of emergencies, or both natural or man-made. The command structure is formed with a commander, incident commander. In this case, it was the Department of Health, U.S. Coast Guard, and EPA. Matson was a participant in the organization.
Was it a part of the team?
They were part of the team, yeah. So we did form an incident command structure to deal with the emergency. And the logical is that you bring all the organization, the assets together to solve a common problem. And you bring all the resources to deploy and organize accordingly so that you can provide the most efficient, effective way of dealing with that emergency in a very short time.
Up to this point, it sounds like what we have found it was molasses in a laboratory. We have found that there was damage of some kind to marine life, and I don't know, maybe the reef too, whatever was out there close by near the harbor. But what exactly could you do? What could you have done? What did you do in terms of reversing the effect of the molasses on the waterfront?
That was a tough question to answer, and not having to deal with molasses before and what kind of damage it could have caused. I mean, we did look at other areas where molasses spilled onto the land and also in the water. And there really is no what we call a cleanup or remedial action for molasses. I mean, we did hear from the public different ways to remove the molasses, but
The public is always out there.
Yeah, they're very inquisitive and very supportive of providing a remedy. Quite frankly, in the couple of weeks that the molasses spill was occurring and spreading throughout the harbor, Mother Nature basically helped us with that cleanup. Basically, that it basically dissolved and spread throughout the harbor and went outside into the ocean ultimately. But it did create quite a bit of damage. Over 27,000 marine life.
Is that right? Killed.
Killed. That we recovered and stored it for evidence. Also, the coral life was studied and still being studied today. The next phase, what we're in right now, past the response phase is what we call the restoration phase, where actually Department of Land and Natural Resources are actually dealing with that phase of the incident. So they're actually looking at what damage has occurred in the environment. And based on that, they'll do a natural resource damage assessment to determine what kinds of remedial costs and projects is to restore the environment.
There wasn't any threat, though, say, to the water supply or anything like that, because it was at sea. Am I right?
In terms of drinking water supply, yeah, it was never threatened. But you know, in this case, it was so unusual because Keith and his crew are so used to oil spills. There was nothing to place booms and contain.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
This stuff just dispersed. So
Yeah.
it made it almost impossible for anyone to conceive of how to extract it out of the water. It was just too far into its progress that, you know, I don't think anybody ever came up with a scenario to potentially pump it out.
And like oil, you know, it kind of stays on the surface, stays around the surface. Molasses, it really went down most of the water column, you know, down to what, about 40 feet was the harbor depth. So in that respect, how do you clean up the whole harbor, the whole, you know, water?
Can't get it out,
You
it's
cannot,
dissolved.
yeah. And it did affect, we were concerned that the harbor operations might have to be stopped or curtailed. I mean, that would have been a real disaster from an economic standpoint. As it was, some recreational activities, particularly in Kawaoka Basin, had to be stopped or
This
curtailed.
wasn't dangerous for swimming, though,
No, but we told the public to stay out of the water
because
and don't eat the food, just as a precaution.
it might have been, you know, like the thing I mentioned in 2006, you have the change in the chemistry. You don't know if that's going to allow for a greater number of pathogens, who knows what,
Right.
that are already there, but now they hit a critical mass, and before you know it, pathogens like sugar, don't they?
Correct.
I think back then too, there was also the outward concern that so much dead marine life
Oh,
might
yeah,
lead
that
to
too.
the attraction of sharks. And
Yeah.
you know, I mean, it wasn't proven, but nobody thought that was prudent to encourage recreational activity at that
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
Right, that's right.
Well, this was, we had a kind of a pass on this, though. We were lucky that there was, you know, nothing beyond that. If it had been another kind of material, if it had been a material in a ship that was not oil, but some sort of noxious chemical, some toxic material, would have been different and maybe more difficult. But this shows us, I suppose, that we always have to be creative in our way of dealing with risks that we haven't seen before.
I think you hit a point. It's the risk, you know, and how do you mitigate that risk in a very short time? Things that what would go into the environment, like oil or chemicals, you kind of know how to deal with. But when it gets a large amount, then it becomes really a question mark. How do you deal with it?
So did anything change in terms of the way we handle molasses? Anything change in the way that, you know, Matson handles the delivery of materials like molasses on or off ships?
Well, for molasses specifically, there is no shipment of molasses in or out from Honolulu Harbor. They basically shut down that operation. Whether they'll bring that back, you know, I can't answer that. The only operation for molasses right now, and the molasses did come from Maui. Maui is the only, as you know, the only sugar-producing island in the
HCNS.
state. Yes, so
Correct.
the loading and offloading at Kahului Harbor is going on on Maui, but it's not being shipped to Honolulu at this point.
How about pipes along the docks that could be used to transfer other kinds of material?
Well, typically for harbor operations, there is petroleum of various types. And you recall the Sand Island, there was above ground tanks that had a release fairly recently. So there is petroleum products being transferred along the harbor, under the harbor, from Campbell Industrial Park, also to Honolulu International Airport, with storage facilities in Honolulu Harbor. So primarily it's petroleum products that are in pipelines.
Which covers a lot of ground.
Yeah.
That's Keith Kawaoka, Deputy Director, Environmental Health Administration, the State Department of Health, and Stuart Yamada, an engineer and the Chief of the Environmental Management Division, the State Department of Health. When we come back after the short break, I'd like to ask you guys how you sleep at night. Yeah? We'll be right back.
Ted Ralston, folks, host of our show at ThinkTech Hawaii called Where the Road Leads, where we talk about technology influencing the future of Hawaii. Technology, of course, is the art of solving problems. We always bring in interesting and informed guests who can see from different perspectives and different points of view how that future might unfold and how technology can assist us in getting there. So once again, join us 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock on Fridays. Ted Ralston, your host. And please, if you have ideas that you'd like us to address on this show or folks who you think should be on it, let us know.
Hi, my name is Andrew Howard. I'm an astronomer at the Institute for Astronomy at the University of Hawaii up in Manoa. I'd like to tell you about the annual open house that we're having. This year it is on April 6th, 11 to 4 p.m. It's an all ages event, kids, grown-ups, even people in between, everyone is welcome. We have a lot of really fun activities. You get to meet astronomers, look at yourself in an infrared camera, play with Legos, make robots, look at videos. You can even make some of the kids like to make comets out of gravel and snow. Even adults like to do that too. You'll be able to look at the sun with a solar camera safely. It's really a great activity. We do this every year in April, and I hope to see you this year. Thanks.
Okay, we're back. We're live with Keith Kawaoka and Stuart Yamada of the State Department of Health, and we want to talk about some other of these case studies, if you will, which demonstrate exactly what the Department of Health does and can do in the case of environmental problems that could affect public health. Stuart, during the break, you were talking about the
Waimanalo Gulch.
Waimanalo Gulch, which was a special case.
Right, the city's largest sanitary landfill. Basically, in December and I think in January of 2011, there was huge rainstorms, what they call 50-year rainfall events. Very, very odd that occurred in the Ewa Mountains, and basically the landfill was not primed to handle that just yet. They were in the progress of building a stormwater diversion system. So there was no diversion system. The stormwater basically diverted through the landfill and basically washed out major portions of the landfill. So I don't know if you recall syringes and other lovely items floating along the west coast of Oahu. Was quite the situation that we had never
People
ever
finding them on beaches and all that. Yeah.
for quite some time, but nothing like that had ever happened. We can't say we practiced for that.
So what do you do? So again, it's the thought process of keeping nimble and recognizing that things that you never expected can happen, and then figuring out where the resources go and how you deploy your people and so forth. It's pretty complicated. And of course, it happened at 2 o'clock in the morning.
On a weekend.
Okay. So what'd you do?
Oh, very similarly, actually. EPA came down because, after the initial shock of, nobody could believe that it was actually portions of the landfill had washed out to sea. In my case, our regulatory programs, it involved our solid and hazardous waste branch who permits the landfill. It also involved the clean water branch who tries to control discharges from the landfill, but no way is in anybody's permit are you allowed to discharge portions of the landfill into the ocean. So this just blew the model out of the realm. And of course, Keith's crew, who was the emergency response team, were primarily involved at that point. But it was quite a daunting situation because the landfill had quite a bit of water held up there, and they needed to get rid of it because at that time they were claiming that there were structural dangers within the landfill and it could collapse further.
And then you'd have all of that coming down the hill.
Yeah, your imagination could run pretty wild,
Yeah,
but it wasn't
That
a pretty
wouldn't be
situation.
good for public health.
Not in any way, no. But
So ultimately, you cleaned it up. But that must have involved a lot of people working on the beaches and in the shallow areas and picking things up by hand. Certain risk in that too.
definitely. And in this case, the city's contractor, it's clear where it came from. There's no doubt that they had to initiate that and provide the crews
Medical disposal company.
to continually pick up and scour the coastlines.
Yeah.
And of course, public groups were also doing that too.
Good. Well, so the public came to your assistance then? Or maybe just gave you advice?
A little of both.
Okay. Well, what do you worry about now? I mean, there are certain things that are unpredictable. These two cases were clearly unpredictable. Could happen anytime. But, what about the predictable ones? Where we just don't know. We know it's going to happen, but we just don't know where or when. What do we do about those?
Well, overall, our mission is to protect the environment and the public health. They go hand in hand. There are several areas that we are constantly dealing with. Just to give you a few examples, I'm sure Stuart can offer some more, but there is, believe it or not, land contamination of various chemicals and petroleum.
Well, from gas stations way back when, or?
It goes from gas stations all the way up to Pearl Harbor or Honolulu Harbor, large areas like that, where historically petroleum was released into the environment. Whether it was before the environmental era came in, it's historical releases that happened throughout. And we're left with that legacy, if you will, of that kind of contamination still in the ground. So we have been in the process, and we'll still be in the process of dealing with that kind of a contamination. How do you identify where that contamination is, and also how do you clean it up to make sure that the public is protected?
And it doesn't get into the water table.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Example, another one is the Red Hill tanks that you're probably familiar with that happened almost a couple of years ago now, where large petroleum tanks that was built by the Navy pre-World War II and still in operation to this day, 70 years later, had a release of petroleum, fuel into the environment. So it's that kind of
That
thing.
means in the land, near the...
No, in the ground, underground.
I'm sorry.
Because these tanks are actually in the Honolulu Red Hill area. People can't see that, but
They're underground, yeah.
they're built in the mountains, basically. Yeah. There's 20 of these large tanks. Each is about 20 stories high, or equivalent to like the Aloha Tower or the revolving restaurant.
Huge.
Yeah, huge. Can hold about 12.5 million gallons of fuel of various types. So that sits over several important aquifers for the island right now, both for the Navy as well as for the water supply aquifers or nearby aquifers. So that's potentially an imminent or ongoing threat.
And an aquifer is not protected. There's no plastic bag around it. It's just natural rock formation in the land. And so if the fuel is leaking into that part of the land, it could go right into the aquifer if it finds its way in the right direction. This is a big problem for public health.
Oh, absolutely. It does take a long time to reach the aquifer in many cases, but once it's there, it's very difficult to remove it. So you try to prevent that from occurring. But again, a lot of these releases or spills into the environment happened many years ago. And you can't do anything about the past, obviously, but you try to deal with, any remedial action that you can do.
Can you find the path? Do we have tools? Do we have engineering that can find a path and see where something is leaching in a given direction?
Technically, yes, but the underground is just that. So much of it is
Can't
unseen.
see through it, yeah.
In other words, you get your little snippets of information. You drill a hole here, you drill a hole there. And gee, what a surprise. They're not exactly the same. So, you make inferences, you make assumptions. So, you make the best educated guess you can. We all know the prevailing direction that water will flow, but it doesn't mean that's the only direction that water will flow. And, because I come from a drinking water background, that's prevention is it. That's a mantra of environmental programs. Prevention, prevention, prevention is far more cost effective than anything we
So
could
you
do
want
to
to catch it
clean
in
up.
time.
Exactly.
Very first blush, you want to catch it.
Exactly.
So can you do anything on the fuel leaking that way? How do you stop it?
Well, certainly, like Stuart said, you try to prevent what's leaking from the tanks. Any kind of...
Seal up the tank.
Yeah, any kind of technology or techniques that you can do to prevent the tanks from leaking, or providing any additional protections to make sure that what's released from the tank is not getting into the environment is what you try to do. What's been released into the environment, yeah, sampling is just that. You know, unless you have X-ray eyes looking into the ground surface, you really don't know what's there. But doing various types of water and soil sampling, you get an indication of where that release might be heading toward. And there's modeling techniques that you can actually, you know, look at what the fate and transport of that plume, if there is a plume, going to the various aquifers. And then you can kind of target what kind of appropriate remedial action, cleanup technologies there are in place. We've had that occurring, you know, for example, central Oahu, when some of the groundwater, drinking water aquifers were contaminated.
Heptachlor.
Yes,
Heptachlor,
yes,
yeah.
remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that gets very expensive about, you know, cleaning up technologies, and they have to be put in place for many, many, many years at quite a great cost. So again, prevention is the best thing, but if that cannot happen or it's already happened, then you look at what appropriate ways to kind of determine what the extent is of the problem, and then what's the best remedial cleanup technology to put in place.
The price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And you guys are like the first line of defense, because you're out there, you're close to the public on this, and you know, it's more emergent somehow if it involves public health. We care more. So we're almost done with time, but let me ask you to, you know, to leave a message, okay? Leave a message about what you're doing, how the public should think of these things, and why the public should care what you're doing, okay? So, Stuart, why don't you start? And take the camera with the red light.
I think you know, the main mantra we want to insist upon is a couple simple messages. In terms of we want to leave a smaller footprint on the environment. I think that's all of our responsibility. So my friends at Solid Waste, reduce, reuse, recycle, really big words. And to think of what you do on your own property. You might not think it impacts the environment, but every little thing that you do does impact. So everyone needs to be thoughtful about that. And I'll let my boss sell it.
Keith, what would you leave with the public on this?
Well, I think, Jay, like you said, we are sort of the guardians of the environment. And that said, we do that as our job every day. We have very dedicated people doing that. But we cannot do it alone. I think the people, the public, shares in that responsibility by not taking the environment for granted, but also malama the environment as well. So everybody has a hand in making sure that the environment is protected and not deteriorating or affecting the public health. I think that's our biggest challenge. We do that every day, and we take that very seriously.
So up to this point, you may have thought that the environment was something involving construction and permits and environmental impact statements and all that, but there's more to it. And in case you weren't aware, the Department of Health is watching over us, making sure that the environment doesn't go south and give us health problems. It's very nice to talk to you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jay.
So it's Keith Kawaoka, a doctor of environmental engineering, Deputy Director of Environmental Health Administration at the Department of Health, and Stuart Yamada, an engineer. What is a PE anyway?
Professional engineer.
Professional engineer. Chief of the Environmental Management Division of the State Department of Health. We've been talking about environment and how it's part of our health here in Hawaii, the state of health. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Aloha.